So look, greetings. I want to talk a little bit from the perspective of the Centre for Peace Policy Research that we're running here at the Castle of the Muses. This is unique in think tanks on the planet at the moment. A lot of security studies institutions exist, both in academia and in what I can call para-academia, research institutes around the planet. When I studied for my degree at the University of London, I had some time spent with the Centre for Defence Studies at King's College, which does a lot of very good, security and military policies research, probably the most important in the UK. And there are equivalent think tanks, the Institute of Strategic Studies in London. And we also have great foreign policy research institutes, such as Chatham House, which I've also, over the years, been involved with to some extent. What we haven't got anywhere, it seems to me, and I've carefully looked, there's nowhere on the planet that's actually doing peace policy research, which, as a scholar of peace, seems to be a real lacuna. And so, how can we get peace on this planet if we're not actually thinking through peace and joining the dots and connecting up the issues that need to be addressed? Peace is a very complex thing. People are fairly good at military policy. The British Army, the American Army, French Army collectively have proved they can win wars. Guerrilla forces, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, they're quite good at creating havoc and violence and destabilising situations. Even ISIS, this new Al-Qaeda affiliated thing, can prove that it can capture cities, and it's captured Mosul, and it can terrorise populations, and it can, it can win wars using violence. Or it can win battles, should we say. So what are we going to do as a planet? Is our choice to go on doing war fighting, violence, and further military strategy development, or can we kind of step back from the brink and say, look, it's time to think through how we're going to do peace as a planet, as a global civilization? And if so, then we need to do some serious thinking, because just as wars are not won without serious thinking, intelligence, strategy, brilliant complex issues involved in winning a successful war, like when the British and Canadians, Americans invaded at D-Day. That required immense planning and forethought and intelligence. Well, what I'm arguing is that if we're going to get peace on this planet, it's going to require even more thinking, more forethought, and more planning than even that lot required. Another example, let me talk about the Manhattan Project. That was organised by General Groves. Oppenheimer, the great scientist who had a PhD from a British university, was put in charge of getting the greatest physicists and scientific minds in the world, in the Allied world, together. And they all worked on creating a fission bomb in wartime conditions. And it was probably the most significant conglomeration of brain power that had ever been brought together on the face of the earth for a common task. And it created the atomic bomb. Unfortunately, that's then unleashed, not only tragedy for the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also it unleashed a nuclear arms race, which is still with us. The overabundance of nuclear arms throughout the world is still horrendous. Behind where I'm sitting here, Britain's nuclear deterrent submarines exercise from time to time. So, fine, great, massive scientists create nuclear bombs, the after effects are still with us. What I'm saying is we need an equivalent, a greater concentration of minds than the Manhattan Project, to create the antidote to nuclear war, the antidote to violence, and the antidote to, the nuclear bomb and the arms race. Now this project, it was foreseen by Linus Pauling, the great chemist who researched for his academic scientific work in chemistry. He looked at the chemical bonds that form molecules that make all life possible, and all matter possible, actually. How is it that these complex molecules are bound together? And he was awarded a Nobel Prize for his work in chemistry. But then he worked in peace research, and he worked with Einstein and many other great thinkers, and proposed, in 1958, he proposed a World Peace Research Organisation should be created, the WPRO. which should have 20,000 full-time academic researchers, scientists, combining their minds and their research for the cause of peace. Now that body still hasn't come into existence. The closest we have to it is a thing called IPRA, International Peace Research Association, which is tiny in comparison. It's a scattered network of social scientists and scholars and historians and philosophers and some natural scientists, anthropologists and so on, looking at all different aspects of peace and demilitarization and disarmament studies. We're meeting in Turkey in a couple of weeks' time. But even in all that archipelago of scholarship, there's nobody else thinking through what a peace policy would look like. People are doing parts of it. What I'm trying to do here at the castle is aggregate the findings, synthesize. My job as coordinator of philosophers to peace in the whole of Europe, and involved on the steering committee for the global body of philosophers to peace, is to ask, how can we put all this data together? Where can we go to get peace? Because we don't like the current situation of, look at the people of Gaza suffering, look at the trauma that these largely young people, as Jon Snow's recent television report points out, these people in Gaza are kids basically, average age 17. Is it the best that we can do is just bomb them? I'm an elder, I'm a grandfather. I'm appalled that we elders can't do better than just bomb our kids, right? So there's got to be a better way. And this is where thinking comes in. This is where philosophy gets a hard edge and comes up with policy proposals. And so what I want to share with you as Director of the Centre for Peace Policy Research is some hard-nosed, practical policies. And I'd like some politicians out there. Politicians are supposed to be involved in policy implementation. But politicians are too involved in the cut and thrust of gerrymandering for power. They don't have time to sit back and think through the policies. They don't actually have time for thinking. And so I'm giving you some ideas, people. Please, get with the mission here. Things are bad. I want to start with just observing that things are very bad at the moment. I've just heard reports about what's going on in Syria. This is catastrophic, okay? Syria used to be a multi-faith, multicultural, advanced society. Damascus was a town you could go and have an extraordinary experience of Islam at its best, tolerant Islam in the great mosque there. It's where Ibn Arabi, the great Sufi sheikh, is buried. Damascus was where St. Paul first encountered, the supernaturally risen Christ and realised that there's a continuity between this world and the supernatural kingdoms of the afterlife. And the whole of what we know as Christian theology was born in that encounter just outside the gates of Damascus. And it's one of the oldest cities in the world. And now look at it. People are in trauma. They don't know who to trust. They're all killing each other. And we have a situation now where I've just read that in Syria just recently two women were stoned to death for adultery. Okay, now I thought that was something that mankind had moved beyond. Even Christ himself, the Rabbi of Galilee, kind of had an antidote to that kind of barbarism. I mean, everybody commits errors in their life, and Christ's point was, don't throw the stone unless you're without sin. And the irony, of course, is that the minute you throw the stone, you would be sinned. You'd be sinning, so you have to put the stone down. So I would say that kind of punishment, if that's continuing now in the 21st century in Syria, which was an advanced Islamic democratic society, we're going back into the Stone Age here, folks, and therefore there's something going wrong with the thinking of the policy and strategic planners that are making policy for the West and for the Middle East. There's enough intelligence, surely, on this planet, and I mean moral intelligence, to create a situation where that doesn't happen. And something needs to be done. Another thing I want to say, I've also read about Syria, and I think it was Iraq, in the territories controlled by ISIS or Islamic State. Not only are they enforcing stoning for adultery on women, but they're also enforcing clitorectomies again. Now this genital mutilation of women is the most horrendous manipulation of people's identity and their right to sexual experience, which is again totally against Islam. It's totally against any kind of human civilized values. We all have the right to be. It's an ontological right, and to enact that barbaric disfigurement on women forcefully, is again, we're going back into the Stone Age. And then finally, as if that wasn't bad enough, let me say that a few weeks ago the reports that ISIS fighters had crucified, in the same way that Jesus was crucified, had crucified some other Muslims who just had a slightly different view of Islam, right? And came along and nailed them up. One of them got away and told the story. This is absolute sheer barbarism. How can we as a global community, how can we as the world of intelligent, educated people, we've had an enlightenment here in Europe, we did this kind of stuff a long time ago. We had civil wars where people used to do that kind of thing. In the British Civil Wars, the Cromwellian army went around and cut the noses off all the royalists dead at the Battle of Naseby because they thought they were obviously wizards and witches. Occult wars is a thing of the past, folks, and since then we had an enlightenment, and we had people like Kant and Hegel who pointed out that spirit is a thing of immense beauty and wisdom and love, and that kind of violence is unnecessary and ignoble to the human condition. It destroys our own humanity, the perpetrator of the violence as much as the victim of the violence. So, and then we also have in the taking over of Mosul, one of the most amazing cities in the Middle East, near Nineveh, which used to be a centre of great multicultural wisdom. It's the kind of place you go in Gurdjieff's wonderful book Journeys to the East and mingle with mystics from all places. And there were some of the most ancient Christian people on the planet there, going right back to the times of Christ and Thomas, his disciple. And I've always felt an identity with the Thomas tradition of Christianity. I've written a book of Thomases. Thomas was the Gnostic, the doubting figure who was one of the most devoted of disciples because he was devoted to truth. I don't think Christ wanted adulation and being put on the pedestal. I think he actually wanted people that knew what he was talking about and getting on with it. And that is love and compassion and wisdom, which is why I think he sent Thomas to India. But in Mosul there's a great cathedral to St. Thomas. And the Thomas Christians were the Eastern Oriental Christians. And therefore I feel a huge sorrow when I read that in Mosul the orders have gone out from ISIS to all the Christians, either convert to Islam or pay a huge tax, protection money, or we kill you, or leave. This again is just total barbarism. I'm sorry, these people are not Muslims. They're hijacking Islam as if it's some kind of thuggery and some kind of protection racket, like a kind of gangsterism. I've even heard also, I've talked to friends in London, in the East End of London, that some so-called pseudo-Muslims are effectively doing the same thing. They're operating as thieves in gangs, stealing things from people's houses, and then splitting up the booty according to Islamic law and justifying it and saying, well, they're pagans, they're not Muslims, we're entitled to rob them. And, if we have to kill a few on the way, that's fine, they're non-Muslims. With all due respect, my friends, this is really seriously barbaric behaviour. And it has to stop. And it has to stop. And what I'm going to present, hopefully, in this very brief talk is, from the perspective of the Centre for Peace Policy Research, how it can be got to stop. So, there are two ways, really. There's the non-violent strategy of persuasion and education, okay? And for this we need a concerted effort by the world's interfaith community, and particularly the Islamic community. All imams, all leaders of the Islamic world who've studied and researched and who have higher degrees, who are at the level of imams and so on, have to come out in one voice and say this kind of barbarism has got to stop. And really there needs to be a council of Islamic elders that can go into places like Mosul, go and talk to the leaders of this ISIS faction. You know, the great academic centres of the Islamic world, like Al-Azhar, like the universities of Saudi Arabia, Jeddah and so on, you know, there's some profound Islamic scholars out there who should be jumping up and down, tearing their hair out, and going talking to these people who profess, I believe, to be Sunni Muslims. They're not acting in any way, shape or form according to the Sunnah, which was Muhammad's own, you know, way he acted. And if you go back to the Islamic legal sources, this kind of brutalization of women and of you know, and of non-Muslims is antithetical to the letter, but also to the spirit of Islam. And so there needs to be a kind of council of Islamic scholars and elders and theologians who can go and confront this evil at source. And also then to work with other religious leaders like the Christian community of Mosul and other places in the Middle East, and really develop a peace plan. You know, these civilizations have lived together in harmony for many, many centuries, and it never got this bad. And this is where the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East comes in, which I chair. And I'm inviting anyone from these traditions, be it from the Nestorian Christian community, from the Syriac Christian community, the Catholic tradition, the different forms of Islamic communities, the Sunni, the Shia community, the Alawite in Syria, or the Armenian Christians, and so on and so on. We have to have a conversation here about what kind of Middle East we actually want to live in. Do we want a Middle East which is full of this kind of barbarism? Or do we want a Middle East where a person is free and able to walk from Damascus to Beijing along the Silk Route, trading, stopping in tea houses, caravanserais? You know, the whole idea of Islam was surely to create conditions of civilized peace among human beings. You can't, for instance, do your Umrah, you can't do your pilgrimage to Mecca if you're going to be harassed and robbed on the way and beaten. And, you know, the whole point of Islam was to create an energy of conviviality and love and faith between people. And not just among Muslims in the narrow sense of that definition, but among all people who respect learning, all people of the book, all people who've surrendered to some kind of vision of higher truth. And that includes all the great faiths of mankind, and all people that genuinely seek for peace. So my proposal is that the other way is obviously military intervention. And the Centre for Peace Policy Research, I would say 99.99 times out of 10, you go for the non-violent intervention. You try and work with persuasion, with teaching, with learning together. But if that kind of barbarism continues, and if that kind of ignorance is unchecked, then I'm afraid, you know, there is a place for the warrior and the one who then takes a stand against that kind of barbarism. And the international community has to get its act together. And, you know, under UN auspices, make a serious intervention to prevent that kind of barbarism taking hold in that most beautiful part of the world. You know, because many people, for instance, in Iraq would say that, look, none of this happened when Saddam Hussein was in power. We had a civilized society. Yes, he was a strong man, but people were safe to walk down the streets. We had sewage, we had water, we had electricity, we had roads that worked, we had schools where men and women could go, we had universities. We were one of the most advanced countries in the Middle East. And now look what's happened. You know, the West intervened and we've been bombed to smithereens and blown back into barbarism. Now we've got people stoning people to death. Well, I do think the West is responsible for this kind of chaos and anarchy that's broken out. I think America and Britain and the other states that intervened in 2003 against the will of the vast majority of the people of Britain and America created this power vacuum into which these nefarious forces are then enabled to operate. And I therefore think that Obama and Cameron and Western leaders have a moral duty to ensure that that kind of after effect is dealt with. And it can be dealt with peacefully and non-violently, as I say, through persuasion and education. But it can also be dealt with in a more, forceful way. And I think there is a case occasionally for that, that force may be necessary. But let's discuss it, and let's be very clear about the goals. It's also very interesting, I think, that Russia, from what I've read, has tried to intervene or to help the Iraqi government contain some of these ISIS forces in northern Iraq, and has actually lent planes and so on. Now, if this is true, I don't know, but certainly Russia is aware of the problems of what happens if those kind of barbarous elements are allowed to be unchecked. So I think if there were to be military intervention to contain ISIS in Iraq and Syria, it should be an international intervention after serious discussion and debate between NATO, between Russia, between Turkey, between other Islamic countries, and it should have full UN authorization and backing. And it should be a minimum restraining peacekeeping operation to save and protect the men and women of those regions that have been terrorized by ISIS. And it should have a definite end date, and it creates a civic infrastructure which can then get life back to normal. But the preferred way is a non-violent intervention. But that requires, serious thinking and serious planning, and it requires peace policy thinking. And that's what I'm willing to engage in discourse about. I want to talk, I've also posted and authored recently a 19-point peace plan, because meanwhile, another part of the forest, we've got the Iraq-Gaza problem going on. Sorry, the Gaza-Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which is horrendous and simultaneous. So from the perspective of the Centre for Peace Policy Research, I've been extremely perturbed at the reports of what's going on in Gaza. When I was in Israel and Palestine in 2008, I met a Sheikh Abu Palestine, a lovely Sufi elder up near Haifa, who actually was prepared to take me to Gaza to meet some people that he knew, and sadly I didn't have time to take him up on that. I'd love to visit Gaza and meet some of the thinkers and strategic policymakers in that country, in that place. The 19-point plan I proposed for Gaza is that this ceasefire, which thank God on this Sunday is still holding, should be extended, and that a demilitarization should take place. I think Hamas have to relinquish their rocket firing. They just have to stop it. And Israel likewise has to disengage. Its military forces have to go. And there has to be a truce in which the military sides of both the Israeli and the Palestinian forces are disengaged. And then what I propose, and this is quite a radical proposal, but I've thought this through in great length, and I think it would work. I can't see another game plan in town. The UN should be asked to send in a peacekeeping force into Gaza to ring the city, and it would have the job of disarming the rockets of Hamas. I mean, Hamas are going to have to agree this. But simultaneously, they would never agree unless they get their demands. And the UN is going to have to also supervise that. So the UN would operate as a buffer between the Israeli Defense Force and the civilians in Gaza. So no more bombing, no more tanks invading Gaza, no more troops going in. But likewise, no more rockets coming out of Gaza. Okay, so the UN is actually earning its keep. It's actually providing a peacekeeping force, which could be an international force from Canada, my home country, Ireland, Turkey, a mixture of places, Norway, who'd have the skills to do that. And then what I've also proposed is that I've heard from senior Palestinian leaders, colleagues who used to work in London as the head of the Palestinian government's representation to Britain, that they wanted to join the Commonwealth. As soon as they get independence as a state, Palestine wants to apply to become the 54th member of the Commonwealth. I think that's a superb idea as a Canadian-British dual citizen. You know, I love the Commonwealth. We're having this amazing Commonwealth Games going on in Glasgow at the moment. To see the full colour and panoply, the multicultural immensity of the Commonwealth is heartwarming, that it's possible to have 54 nations that are held together by common bonds of certain values, certain rules to do with fair play and decency and human rights and tolerance and so on. All the best things that the Commonwealth stands for. I think Palestine should be invited to join the Commonwealth, and I think discussion should begin immediately. I think the Palestinian leadership should take that proposal seriously, realise the potential behind it. And I think that the Commonwealth has expertise in helping new states come into being. Time and time again, at independence, you know, when states remain or join the Commonwealth. And Namibia and Rwanda have recently joined. Now, they didn't historically have ties with the British Empire, but they nevertheless wanted to become members because they could access the support and assistance the Commonwealth can give. Well, the Commonwealth's got a whole network of medical support, civil engineering, you know, police advice, legal advice, development aid, development assistance, and scientific advice, technical advice. So I think all those facilities would then be opened up for access for the Palestinian people, both in Gaza and in the West Bank. And we can work with them to build a new peace-loving state, because the precondition for this in the 19 peace plan, the 19 points of the peace plan, is that Palestine signs a declaration of non-violence with Israel. You know, you get to join the Commonwealth and become the 54 member nation state of it, and a peaceful state, having agreed to a non-violence with Israel. And I think the other proposal is obviously civil engineering projects. The Commonwealth could fund the rebuilding of the airport, the building of a port in Gaza, and the building of a railway link between Gaza and the West Bank. You know, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Britain, you know, these are wealthy countries that would give development assistance to help this. And I think in doing so would help solve this problem. And, you know, we can all breathe a huge sigh of relief. I also think there's a moral duty on the British Commonwealth to do this, because it was our mandate after World War I which led to this chaos. And I will repeat that I believe that it was a fatal error by the British administrators in the mandate of what was called Palestine, when we left in 1948 with an Israeli state being declared and no equivalent Palestinian state. I think there was a failure of leadership at the highest level in Whitehall. I think it was the Attlee government who was so, I think, myopic and short-sighted as to see the consequences of their actions, and they left this total chaos that's been there ever since. I think it's time to make amends, and what I'm suggesting here, therefore, is that someone that runs the Commonwealth Interfaith Network, I can only speak from a moral and philosophical perspective. I'm not a politician, but I do believe that we need vision here. And the poor people of Palestine, you know, I've been to Bethlehem, I've been to all around the West Bank, and the Palestinians are amazing people, and they want to live in peace with their neighbours, the Israelis. This is a structure and a means whereby that can happen. And you know, it can't happen soon enough. Okay, so that's the second proposal I'm making, really, from a peace policy perspective. And the third thing I want to address in this very short kind of emergency broadcast, really, is the business about Ukraine and the downing of this Malaysian jet, and the sabre rattling that's going on seems to be, you know, ratcheting up for some kind of new Cold War here, in which some people are saying, you know, Russia and Putin are the devil incarnate, and there needs to be some kind of new sanctions by Europe and Britain. I think this is dangerous talk. I would just like to comment as a peace philosopher. I mean, I've travelled in Russia, I've travelled to Moscow, I have contacts with the Russian philosophical profession. I was talking with them again in Athens last year at the World Congress of Philosophy. You know, this kind of demonisation of Russia and the Russian government, I think, is false, fallacious, and dangerous. I think what the international community and what the British government should be doing is calling for a proper investigation. Pause. Look at the evidence of who downed that jet. It's a tragic, horrific, probably an accident. I mean, if it was separatist rebels in Ukraine, as they're called by the Ukrainian government that is ruling after their own putsch, they would regard themselves probably as the genuine Ukrainian freedom fighters. I mean, nomenclature, disputed terminology is a crucial thing if we're going to get peace here. Regarding the Ukraine, I think that the international community needs to stand back, not take sides here, not sort of exercise rhetorical flourishes to demonise somebody for short-term gains. That just destabilises the atmosphere. And I think what the international community should be doing is pursuing this through the courts legally. The victims of that horrific plane crash should be given assistance to pursue this through the international legal system and get redress. And the people who did it should be brought to justice. If it turns out to have been some little rogue unit of a separatist force in Ukraine, operating either with or without sanction from somewhere higher up the chain, then I think the Russian government, the Ukrainian rebel forces, they have a moral duty to come clean and say, yeah, okay, it was that unit under that particular major. Sorry, he was drunk at the time. It's a total mistake. He's since shot himself or whatever. Let's get the truth here. Let's suspend judgment. Hold your breath till we know who actually did it. Whoever did it should just stand up and say, I'm sorry, I did it. It was a mistake. This is the human way of dealing with it. What doesn't help is for leaders in Whitehall and Britain to be kind of ratcheting up to a situation where we're trying to get Europe as a whole to bring huge sanctions against Russia, which would hurt only Russia and Europe and Britain. What's the point of that? We got over the Cold War, folks. Russia is not the enemy, even though you might wonder if you look at the headlines these days. No, I mean, Russia was an enemy, and we had a huge Cold War, and we went to the brink of nuclear arms, engagements several times, and we got wise. We decided it was better all round if we make a friendship treaty with Russia, and we had the Treaty of Paris in 1990, which ended the Cold War. And I'm saying, be very careful not to stumble back into that nonsense. Russians don't want violence. They're actually very upset about what's going on in Ukraine, because for 200 years, since Catherine the Great's time, Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire, the Tsarist Empire, and then it became part of the Bolshevik system. And there's a lot of people in Ukraine that still want to be identified with Russia and don't feel comfortable about becoming part of a westward-leaning Ukrainian state that wants to become a little sort of appendage to the European Union. And with good reason, they're slightly suspicious of that. Look what the European Union has done to Greece and the economy of Greece. Look, I mean, the fact that the west-leaning Ukrainian government just resigned en masse, I think, tells you how bad it is. What we should be doing is not sort of fighting over who gets which bit of Ukraine, whether Russia or the West or EU, but helping that magnificent country to find peace. And this is again where peace policy research comes in. The EU should be helping with mediation. I've written to Baroness Ashton many times proposing a European Union mediation service be set up. Not a kind of de facto European Union aggrandizement and enlargement service. No, a European Union mediation service which neutrally stands outside its neighbouring countries and helps them to find, a way forward. There's no reason. You see, the whole logic underlying conflict and violence is either-or logic. It's kind of either A or B. If you study quantum physics, if you study the latest thinking in science and you study the latest thinking in metaphysics, it's